You could almost hear a collective sigh of relief across much of the country this afternoon after a judge read out this verdict from a jury in Minneapolis.
Guilty, guilty, guilty.
Derek Chauvin now could face several decades in prison for second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. I'm joined by former Secretary of Public Safety in Massachusetts and former Suffolk County Sheriff Andrea Cabral and the Director of ACLU of Massachusetts Racial Justice Program, Rahsaan Hall. Rahsaan, Andrea, thanks for joining me on such short notice.
Nice to be here.
Andrea, if I can start with you, obviously, what's your reaction to the verdict, and were you surprised by the verdict?
That's an interesting opening question, because he murdered a man in broad daylight while being filmed under color of state law, which is exactly why the family of George Floyd got a $27 million settlement. I shouldn't have to be surprised by the verdict, and I think really that's what the conversation should be about, the starting conversation from this verdict, because of course he should have been found guilty. He was guilty. But we should be talking about what it took to get a jury there in light of all of the history. And we should have some very, very serious conversations about not letting this be a one-off, because it's not. Derek Chauvin is probably the most public, or one of the most public executions, but he is hardly alone.
I want to get back to you on the one-off or not letting it be a one-off in a second. But I'm going to throw caution to the wind and ask the same question of you, Rahsaan, your reaction to the verdict an hour or so after.
It's very similar to Andrea's. I mean, this was the low-hanging fruit. This was the case where there was supposed to be the guilty verdict. We watched a man be murdered on TV with people, aside from himself, pleading for his life, but people around him pleading for his life. But yet, we went into the trial doubting whether we'd get the outcome because we've seen so much injustice. And so for as much as this may be a revelatory moment, that there is some semblance of justice within this system through these convictions, it still doesn't get to the heart of the way policing happens on a day-to-day basis, where some of the harms are just as egregious, whether they result in death, but not likely to get the same outcome.
Well, let's talk about both those things. Andrea, back to you in terms of, is it a one-off or not? Does it change anything, whether it's what prosecutors charge in these kinds of cases, what juries rule in these cases, having the victim be on trial in these cases, cops testifying against cops like happened here? Is there a trickle-out effect from the Chauvin case?
There will be some effect, but it won't be nearly what's necessary, because what's actually necessary is for this country to face what policing and public safety mean to all of the people in this country. It means very different things to white people in this country than it does to people of color. And until we actually face it and change it, there's not going to be a pattern or a consistent amount of change that's necessary. Yes, there will probably be a few more police departments where there are officers willing to testify against other officers. But, you know, trials are very unique, very specific things. You could have picked a different jury and gotten an acquittal. If there had been a different jury, it's possible that there would have been an acquittal. So the conversation has to be much more than what happened in this trial with this jury and these prosecutors and these charges. To some degree, that's almost irrelevant to the conversation we need to have.
Well, it seems to me, Rahsaan, that second conversation that Andrea has mentioned should at least include what we read the other day, I think it was in the New York Times, that during the trial itself, 64 people in this country were killed by police officers, the majority of whom were black or brown. Does the Chauvin case and that startling, at least to me, number shake anything loose in this, I was going to say debate, I don't know if there is a debate, in what should be a debate in this country, Rahsaan?
I mean, I think their decision to convict Chauvin, it doesn't negate the fact that Mr. Floyd's tragic murder is a part of a horrifying pattern of officers using excessive force against people of color. Mr. Floyd is one of more than 5,000 people killed by police since 2015. And so this is, again, a brief moment in time, but within these weeks, we saw the murder of Dante Wright and Adam Toledo. And these are young people, in one instance, a child. And I think the conversation has changed in that more people are talking about it. But for as much as it has changed since 2013, 14, 15, we're still, like, I would have thought after Philando Castile, people would say, okay, this is enough. But still, this is where we are. And so until we change, like I always say, until the only way to get rid of police violence is to get rid of policing in the way that we understand it.
So does that happen? I mean, we were supposed to have this great racial reckoning, too, not just around policing in this country after the murder of George Floyd. It's happened in some quarters, but it hasn't happened to the level, at least in my judgment, Rahsaan, that was predicted by so many well-informed observers around last Memorial Day.
Yeah, I mean, I think people take Dr. King's recitation that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. They take solace in the fact that, justice is a long way off, but at least it's bending. But while there are some folks out there that are trying to get a 90-degree angle in that arc, I think the calls for racial reconciliation, racial conversation will not yield the type of results that we need when we have such a deeply rooted issue around race in the inception of this nation. It's built into the fabric of who we are.
Andrea, let me suggest one thing that I think may, in concert with a speedy and decisive guilty, in this case, may precipitate the kind of discussion and reform, but maybe I'm being naive. We went from when the looting starts, the shooting starts, President, to a guy yesterday who said that he prayed that the jury would make the right decision. And while he never said the word guilty, he also said the evidence was overwhelming. So clearly President Biden was saying that he was praying for a guilty verdict in this trial. Does that tenor from the man at the top, particularly considering who he followed, create an environment where it's more likely the discussions, the debates, the conversations, the reform you two are talking about is likely to happen?
Leadership matters, and action that follows good leadership matters. So I think we'll see that from the Biden administration. We'll see that in the leadership of Merrick Garland. That will happen. Some of that will happen. But the difference here is killings of Black and brown people continue to happen at the hands of police. And when people take to the streets and protest, and they have done that in record numbers over the last couple of years, it's astonishing how much regular people feel compelled now to become activists and to make their voices heard. But every time this happens, leaders, both Black and white, call for calm and tell people that violence isn't the answer. Well, violence is what brought people to those streets to begin with. And until leadership, not just in the President of the United States, but every governor, every mayor, and we know we're not going to have that in red states. Every governor, every mayor, every city councilor, every single person in elected leadership begins to show leadership around this and begins to confront it. It's not even, I keep calling it a conversation. That's wrong. It's confrontation with a nation's history that brought us to the point where we are now, where maybe someone like Joe Biden isn't going to be enough, because we, as 60 Minutes showed us with Mr. Oathkeeper, who was interviewed, law enforcement and the military have been infiltrated steadily since 2009, and we are seeing that, the results of that and the consequences of that now. So getting a handle on it now is going to look a lot different than it would have looked in 2009.
Andrea, you're a former prosecutor. Is a fair-minded prosecutor who was reluctant to do what Keith Ellison did in Minnesota more likely to be willing to go where the facts take him or her as a result of this case, or no?
Depends entirely on what voters are telling that elected official to do. Because if you're talking about an attorney general, you're talking about an elected official or a DA.
Right.
The ACLU's program, What a Difference a DA Makes, that nothing could be more true than that. And it is also true of attorneys general. So if the message that they're getting from the people who have the power to take them out of office is that you will do the right thing, you will investigate, you will bring charges where they are warranted, then attorneys general will do it.
Speaking of attorneys general, last thing from me, Rahsaan, let's speak about the one that Andrea just mentioned, Merrick Garland. What does he do tomorrow to show that this is not a one and done? What do we need to hear from the Department of Justice?
I think what's warranted is an affirmation of this verdict and recognizing that what this verdict communicates is something that is ever present in policing throughout the country, and therefore the Department of Justice is going to take a renewed effort in investigating pattern and practice cases throughout the country. This is not only, this is the most extreme example, but there are a lot of other examples that warrant the same type of investigation, discipline, and exposure, because it goes to the very core of the problems in policing.
Rahsaan Hall, Andrea Cabral, thanks for your time, and I hope you'll come back soon to continue this discussion.
Thanks for having me.